Hello and welcome. My name is Joe O'Mara. I'm the Head of Aviation Finance with KPMG. And on behalf of KPMG and Airline Economics, I'm delighted to be joined by Peter Barrett. Peter is the CEO of SMBC Aviation Capital. Peter, thanks for joining us today. I think most of our watchers will know very well who SMBC are, but maybe for the benefit of the few who don't, you might just tell us a little bit about you guys.
Okay, thanks, Joe, and thanks for the invitation. Good to see you again, albeit virtually. But okay, so as you said, hopefully most people will know us, but SMBC Aviation Capital is actually our 20th anniversary this year in 2021. So we were our 20th birthday. And we're one of the large global aircraft leasing companies. We're owned by two of the largest institutions in Japan, the SMBC Group, one of the big financial groups, and Sumitomo Corporation, one of the big trading houses. So we've an owned, managed, and committed fleet of over 600 airplanes. Spread throughout the world, over 100 airline customers. So, really one of the big full-service aircraft leasing companies. Our portfolio is very much focused on new technology aircraft. I think we're close to 50% new technology now, and very much a narrow-body portfolio. It's over 80% narrow-body. So a young, fuel-efficient, environmentally friendly fleet, and one that we're using the current market to continue to develop and grow.
Peter, given the size and scale and the breadth of your operations, you'd have a great overview of how 2020 went. Obviously, a year like no other. Maybe looking back over the last 9 or 10 months, and I should say we're recording this in the first week of January. From your airline customer perspective, how did performance evolve over that period from March onwards? And what differences were you seeing in the various geographies in which you operate?
Well, I mean, looking at the last 9 or 10 months, I think, first of all, there was a sense of, I suppose, shock at the initial lockdowns, and as literally everything literally dropped off a precipice. And I think that so our airlines, excuse me, our airlines, I think, were coming to terms with that, and it took a while for that to kind of people to really figure out what was happening. But I think then, it varies from market to market, from airline to airline. I think people then started to kind of focus on, okay, this is a big problem, this is a real challenge, and started to focus on, how do they preserve cash, how do they manage cash, how do they keep the show on the road. And I think, moving from region to region, I think every region is a little bit different. I mean, clearly we see, for example, a market like China was the first to be hit, but clearly has recovered well in terms of its domestic market, where you see other markets have been, they have taken longer to recover. You see different support from governments, and the behavior of governments has varied from market to market, both in terms of direct investment by certain governments into airlines, or perhaps broader economic supports in the wider economy in terms of furlough payments or other types of financial support, and other markets where there's no support at all. So it's quite varied, and I think trying to break it down by, say, in the Americas, Europe, and Asia is probably, I think, a bit oversimplistic. I think each market has some people who've handled it well and have managed it well, and some have markets, and each market has ones that haven't handled it well. So it's been a kind of a mixed bag across the piece. But clearly, Joe, it's been a really challenging period for our customers, and indeed for the wider aviation industry, for manufacturers and lessors as well. I think, a business like SMBC Aviation Capital, at many levels, where I think this is a time where the strength and financial wherewithal of our shareholders really comes to the fore. So I think, it's been a challenging time for us, but I think, we've had great support from our shareholders, and we've been focusing on trying to support our customers where we can and working with them where we can. And in some cases, there's been restructurings and deferrals and all the things that you know about. So it's been a really challenging 9 months for all of our customers around the world, and indeed for the wider industry.
Can I ask, when you look at the airline side, given the scale and depth of the crisis, we've probably seen a number of airline failures, but not as many as you might have expected, or formal restructurings. You mentioned the government support, which is obviously key to that. What's your outlook maybe over the next 6 months on that front? Are you concerned that we're going to see a lot more airline failures, or do you think we've seen some kind of leveling out on that front?
Yeah, I think there's a bit more to go. I mean, I wouldn't use the phrase, I think we'll see a lot more. I think there certainly will be some more, perhaps not failures, but restructurings. I think there's, I don't think we've seen the bottom of this yet. I think the next kind of 4 or 5 months are going to be challenging for the industry until you really see meaningful rollout of the vaccines, which I think we'll start seeing some impact of in the summer of 21. And there's been a lot of damage done to balance sheets and the cash positions, and lots of the the businesses of airlines around the world. And I think we're going to be looking at the consequences of that, really, not just for the next number of months, but the next number of years. But I suppose one of the things I've seen over the years, Joe, in the last 30 years I've been in the industry, airlines are very resilient. I mean, it's kind of hard to kill them, and they tend to trade and find ways to keep going. And I think you've seen that in this downturn, a downturn, as you said, like no other. And I think you're going to continue to that. So I think you will see some further challenges for airlines, and there will be some failures, there will be some more restructurings. But I think airlines are very focused on survival and keeping the cash position up and keeping going. So I think and if I think, as I think we see some level of passenger demand recovering in the middle of this year in a meaningful way, then I think that will I think a lot of airlines have built their business models for 2021 on that. And I think if we see that, then I think you'll see a lot of them getting through this year.
And on the new deal side, you guys have been reasonably active on the sale and leaseback side and new transactions. In evaluating new transactions, has COVID changed the metrics in which you evaluate new transactions and looking at airlines, or is it the same as you've done before with a certain level of increased rigor?
I think the fundamentals are the same, but probably, as you said, a bit more. I would say a bit more so. I mean, ultimately, in our business, we've always focused first and foremost on the assets of what are the aircraft we're buying, and then clearly in the current environment, you're obviously going to be very focused on the counterparty. And we see the current, as you said, we've been quite active over the last 9 months in the sale leaseback market, which we're very much picking the deals that we think are going to be robust. We're looking for good, young, almost, I think the vast majority of the deals we've done have been narrow body aircraft. And it's with counterparties that we think are going to be in a position to get through this challenging time, but also actually in a position to take advantage of the recovery. That's very much been the focus of what we've been at. But a big metric at the moment obviously is cash, and it's a big thing we look at. What is somebody's cash position? What is their access to it? How much are they burning? How much are they going to need? How far does it get them? And that's certainly, if I had to pick one thing that we're doing more of, it's probably that analysis on cash and what that means, what the cash position of airlines is going to be for the next number of months and indeed number of years. But fundamentally, we're still looking at good aircraft with good counterparties, with solid strategies that are going to, be both survivors and thrivers in the long term.
And in looking at the debt side, in focusing on the aircraft leasing market, what are your thoughts on where the capital markets and the debt markets currently sit? We've seen obviously the large scale lessors still showing remarkable resilience in what they're able to earn on the unsecured market, but are able to raise in the unsecured market. So interested in your thoughts over the capital markets piece and also the debt markets piece, and how challenging that might be in kind of getting the trading environment kind of properly restarted again.
Yeah, I think the capital markets, as you said, particularly for good big IG lessors, have been proven particularly robust. I do think there is I think there is a bit of a divide between some lessors who've been able to raise funding at a I suppose an acceptable rate. I wouldn't say a good rate, but an acceptable rate, and those who possibly can't. And look, ultimately, I think that's a reflection as much of the macro environment in terms of the Fed and all of the way central banks, including the Fed around the world, are behaving. So I think that's provided a level of liquidity and supply to the market that's actually, even for more challenged sectors like aviation, is flowing through for them, particularly for the better counterparties. So I think that's likely to continue as long as the supply is kept, the spigots are kept open, they keep the money flowing. I think that's likely to continue. I think the debt market, the bank markets, the traditional bank markets are probably a different thing. I do see, as you probably have seen in the past, Joe, is that banks tend to get more cautious and more conservative in this environment. So I think that's probably a much harder market than the capital markets in terms of fundraising. Not impossible. And for example, we're seeing the ECAs perhaps being to take a bit of a comeback, a bit of a return to the market, and I think you'll probably see more of that, both in terms of the European and US export credit agencies in 2021. But definitely the bank market has narrowed considerably and is probably not as going to be as liquid or as viable, at least for 2021. I do think that that's an important market for trading, and I think or certainly our expectation is that the trading markets will remain soft over the next 12, 18 months, particularly because I think smaller lessors are going to probably find it more challenging to raise the debt portion of the deal to allow them to get into the trading market. But we do think that's going to recover. I mean, the fundamentals of the air travel haven't changed in our view. Clearly, this is going to take a while to recover, but I think when recovery does happen, it'll be strong. And I think that the funding markets and the trading markets will follow that in 22 and 23.
Just on the capital markets, maybe on the structured side, we've seen the ABS channel become extremely important in funding, as you mentioned, the trading environment, sales into it. Something like $25 billion of aircraft assets were funded over the last 3 years. What are your thoughts on where that market might go? Obviously, it closed in 08, 09, but we have a very fundamental difference here because, as you say, there's so much cash out there. So while it's closed for aviation, the wider ABS market is fully open. Your thoughts on when we might see again aviation ABS come back to the market?
I think it depends, Joe, on what the purpose of the ABS is. I think as you correctly said, I mean, ABS is either going to be a funding tool or it's going to be a trading tool, and I think you'll see that the recovery of those two purposes probably be a little bit different. I think that, as you said, there's lots of liquidity in the broader financial market, so I think some of that will start to appear in the ABS market for aviation in 2021, but I think it'll be for funding deals. So I think you'll see conservatively structured, relatively low leverage deals where people will use the ABS market effectively as a way to raise debt against aircraft. I think it'll be, I think getting further up that capital structure into the C and the E notes, so that you can actually, if you're using it as a tool to trade, to sell aircraft, I think it's going to take quite a while longer to recover. So I think it will be a phased recovery. So I do think you'll see some debt financing ABS done in 2021, but I think it's going to be a while before we see the type of full capital structure A to E note type of deals done for aircraft. I think it's going to take probably a couple of years before we see those coming back again.
And on the OEM side, how have you viewed their behavior over the course of the crisis? And how do you see the crisis impacting on how OEMs will interact with aircraft lessors over the medium term?
Yeah, I mean, I think the OEMs, and I suppose in reality, it's let's put the engine manufacturers aside for a moment, but they obviously are an important component of that. But let's just look at the two airframe manufacturers for the moment. And I think, Airbus and Boeing came into the crisis in a very different position. So obviously, in the Boeing case, their principal production, their principal aircraft was not being built, it was not being delivered. So I mean, I think how they responded to it was different. I mean, they were focused rightly on getting the MAX safely and properly back in the air, and they successfully did that at the end of last year. Whereas obviously Airbus was producing 50, 60 airplanes a month on the A320 line. So I think Airbus had a harder decision to make in many ways, and I think they made the right decision in reducing production. So, I very much welcome the way that the manufacturers have, been reactive and responsive to the production, cutting back at production, both on narrow bodies and wide bodies, and the rate at which Boeing is going to increase production of the MAX, I think is going to be tempered by demand. I think that's the right thing to do. So, I very much have encouraged the manufacturers to be prudent and cautious about how they manage production, because I think it's, and I would welcome what they've done, and I'd certainly be encouraging them to continue to do that. I think the relationship between lessors and manufacturers, and indeed I think between manufacturers and all aircraft buyers is I think it's going to be an interesting discussion in the broader industry, both for lessors and airlines in the next number of years. I mean, there's an argument to say that in the good times the manufacturers had significant problems in delivering aircraft, and in the bad times the buyers have significant challenges in taking aircraft. So it's quite a kind of a dysfunctional system at the moment. So I think there's a broader long-term debate to have in the industry about how we manage that supply demand and the production rates. And it's not an easy question to answer, and it's a challenging both for the manufacturers and indeed for the buyers of aircraft. I mean, looking specifically at lessors, I think lessors generally, I mean, we've been taking aircraft from manufacturers. We've been working very closely with them. And look, the reality is that it's hard to get aircraft delivered in the current environment. Now, we obviously have the financial wherewithal to buy the aircraft, but we want to make sure that it's the right thing to do for ourselves, for the manufacturer, and then critically for the airline. So we've been working with our airline customers and with the manufacturers to try and get the best, most practical and reasonable outcome in the circumstances. And generally, you know, obviously it's not easy. They're hard discussions, those tri-party discussions, but generally I think we've come to a reasonable outcome in most cases, and I expect that's going to continue through 2021.
And on keeping with the metal side, how do you see the pandemic impacting certain aircraft types, accelerating retirements in some instances, and how do you see that interplaying then with the broader financing environment?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think, you know, I mean, clearly the pandemic downturn, the coronavirus downturn is unique, and it's of a scale and scope and depth that we've never seen before. But fundamentally, it's still a downturn, and I think what will happen as the market recovers will be similar. It has been in previous downturns, albeit probably in a broader and deeper scope and scale. So I think what you'll see is that you know, older aircraft are more likely to get retired sooner. You know, more marginal aircraft types are going to be under more significant pressure. So I think, you know, what you saw in previous downturns, you know, when the first downturn I experienced in the early 90s was it felt the death knell of the L1011, for those of you who are old enough to remember it. Then you saw probably you know, 2001 probably, you know, saw the MD-11 fall out of the market. And I think you'll see similar things in, you know, for the A340 and for older wide bodies, and indeed for older aircraft generally. So I think you'll see that. I also think what you'll see through this is the benefits of a younger, more fuel efficient fleet. And I'm sure you've seen the stats, Joe, but you know, one of the things we find really interesting is that if you look at what airplanes, so you know, airplanes are probably flying about 50 to 60%. The world fleet is probably flying 50, 60% on average, and that's ups and downs that are around the world. But the airplanes that are flying more are the younger airplanes and the more fuel efficient airplanes. So, you know, the utilization rate for a 15, 20-year-old airplane is a lot lower than the utilization rate for, on average, the utilization rate for a 2 or 3-year-old airplane. The utilization rate for, you know, a more fuel efficient version of an airplane like a Neo is going to be much higher than an A1 airplane. So, you know, you're seeing that difference between them. And I think that's, you know, I think that the downturn and the nature of this downturn has really accentuated the fact that, you know, in a highly competitive, highly you know, volatile market that the airlines operate in, you know, the types of aircraft that you operate, the efficiency of them, it makes a real difference to your operation. And I think you're seeing that. And that's I think will be well learned by airlines around the world.
And then looking maybe on the opportunity side, obviously you have a very dislocated, disrupted market, but that will throw out opportunities. We talked to a lot of the transactions you guys have done over the last 9 or 10 months. What opportunities are you seeing out there in the broader market? Are you seeing some return as well to a bit more, if we call it normality, in the pricing of transactions? What are you seeing when you look at the opportunity side?
Yeah, well, I suppose we see, first of all, we do see opportunities, and as you said, we've taken advantage of a number of them. I think what you're seeing is that, you know, airlines continue to need to raise capital, they continue to need to finance aircraft, and what we're seeing is we're doing deals with counterparties that probably wouldn't normally have done sale and leasebacks, and we're doing them at terms that we think are, you know, a decent representation of the type of risk rewards that we're taking. So definitely, you know, we feel that the type of returns we're getting now are a fair reflection of both the counterparties we're doing business with and the circumstances in which we find the market. So I think it's a good time to do business. Now, we've been relatively prudent. While we've done well over $2 billion of sale and leasebacks, you know, we've probably been quite measured in the pace at which we're deploying the capital. And we see that the market's going to continue to need capital over the next 12, 18, 24 months, and we want to make sure that we are able to support our customers, not just to do a big bang in the short term, but actually to keep a fairly steady pace there. So we think there'll continue to be opportunities. I also think actually that you know, one of the things about, not just in terms of deals, but I think one of the important things to think about is you know, the other opportunities we can take as a business in terms of how efficient we are. I mean, one of the things I'm, you know, really pleased about and be very proud about, and I think, you know, this is probably true of many operations around the world. I mean, we literally didn't miss a beat when we moved from a physical work environment to a virtual work environment. And we managed to, even when we're not traveling, we still managed to service our customers, get deals done, work on restructuring, all the things that we're doing. So I think that's a real lesson for all of us in terms of how we run our businesses and how we provide services to our customers. So I think, you know, opportunities aren't just on the deal side. Clearly, there's a lot of opportunities there, but there's also a lot of opportunities on, how we run our businesses, how we think about our business, how we think about our balance sheets, how we think about our funding structures. And I think, it's incumbent on all of us who manage these businesses to make sure that we take not just the lessons of, because there's some good deals to do, but also the lessons about how we operate our businesses. And I think there's been a lot of those lessons in the last 9 months.
And on a macro level, do you think there's any transformative change that might come out of this crisis? Do you see a situation, you talk to some of the airlines that they're looking at sale and leasebacks that didn't before, just given the capital constraints that they have. So do you see a situation where that percentage of leased aircraft takes a material uptick? Or do you see a situation, I was trying out a couple examples, where we might see more of a concentration in the market? We've seen a divergence of asset ownership in the market over the last 10 years. Do you think this will push more consolidation and maybe a return to a tighter concentration of asset owners?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there, Joe. I would say on the broader, what does this mean for leasing? I think and I've talked to a few CEOs of big airlines in the last couple of months about this, and they say that the value of leasing becomes much more apparent because you actually does give you fleet flexibility. It's obviously challenging for lessors in this environment, but it does give you, if you have roll off, it does give the opportunity to manage your fleet more proactively. So I actually think, and also, as we've talked about earlier, there's some very strong leasing companies like SMBC Aviation Capital who have access to capital, who can do sale and leaseback. So it's a great source of funding to airlines in tough markets. So I actually think the downturn actually is probably going to consolidate the role of leasing in the broader aircraft financing industry, and make it probably more important, and an even more important tool for airlines and for the wider industry. So and I think the role of lessors is going to be accentuated. And on the other side of your question, I suppose, and I think, scale is clearly important, and scale does make a difference. We talked about that in terms of, the big investment grade leasing companies have better access to funding, even in this extraordinary market. So I do think you're going to see that the industry will become more, there'll be, the bigger players will get bigger. And I think they will play continue to, and you'd expect that in an industry that's becoming more mature. You expect to see there'll be an element of consolidation and concentration that's almost inevitable. I think the challenge for our industry will be make sure that there is still liquidity in terms of trading aircraft and bringing in new investors and new types of funds and all that kind of stuff. But I certainly think when the dust settles, and I think it's going to take a few years for the dust to settle on this one. I think some of the not all the people who came in during the course of the last 10 years, the last kind of strong market, are going to remain in this industry. And I think you will see that the bigger players will become bigger and more and play a significant role in the industry.
And on that investor side, Peter, as you mentioned, look, I think we're all assume that COVID is a blip, and the question is how big a blip, but you'll still come back to a fundamental fact that air travel will return. Billions of capital will then need to be funded. Where do you see that investor base coming from? You talked about the widening of the investor base that's happened in aviation finance and the sophistication of those investors. Do you see it being from that pool of enlarged investors that they're going to drive the capital that's required? Or do you think the pandemic might bring a new category or type of investor to the space?
I think, having my cake and eat it, I think both are true, Joe. I think the existing investor base, I think, is who's learned something and learned some lessons indeed in the last 9 months, is going to continue to be in. Some will fall out, some are going to say, this isn't for me. But I think a lot will see, particularly as the market recovers, I believe they will see that this is an industry and an asset class that has a long-term role in their portfolios. I think they will continue to be invested in it. But I think that the real challenge for us as an industry is to find new pools of capital in different markets. So, whether the very deep, we touched on this, a very deep investor market in the US, for example. I think we need to tap into new markets in other jurisdictions. So I think important markets in Asia, for example, the Japanese market, which obviously we're very familiar with, which Korea, Singapore, China, all these markets. I think we're going to have to work to deepen those markets and bring in new investors. And I think that's going to be a really important piece of work for our industry in the next decade, so that when the next cycle happens, we've got an even deeper and broader investor pool. But I think the ones that are there are going to do more, and I think we need to find new ones.
And how have you seen, or where do you see the key focus of investors being when you're having conversations with them? Is there an appreciation of the skills and scale of the lease manager? Are they looking at the underlying airline credit? Do they understand the asset class? How have you seen that develop in recent times?
Yeah, I think certainly I don't think you can comment on the last 9 months, because I think investors have been focused on what's in front of them, and I don't think it's probably fair to say that they're thinking about the longer term. But if you look over the last number of years, I think the things you touched on there's definitely more familiarity with the asset classes and what's a good investment, and what's and what are the risk rewards come from different asset classes. Not all airplanes are equal. I also think that people are more conscious of the airline strategy and the counterparty strategy. Actually what ultimately is the business model. What market are these airlines serving? I think investors become much more focused on that, and I do think the service there has become much more important. And I think one thing that I think will become clear over the next over the past 9 months, and certainly over the next couple of years, as I said, as this plays out, is the importance of having a full service professional service company to manage your asset. I think it's going to become much more apparent in the next couple of years than it has been over the last decade.
Here, one area that understandably has taken a back foot as airlines have focused on survival is around ESG, climate change, sustainability. Your thoughts on how the pandemic interacts, or does it, with the aviation space? And just as a tag on to that, is the sector as a whole, and I would include lessors, OEMs, and the airlines, doing enough to talk about the positive things that are being done to tackle climate change from an aviation perspective?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Joe. And one thing I would disagree with you to say it's taking the back foot. I actually, because it's interesting, we've talked, and this is a really important thing for our business. We talk about it and think about it quite a lot. And since we started the business 20 years ago, having a young, fuel efficient, environmentally fleet has always been an important part of our business. I mean, our average age is 4 years. We see the best way for us to service our business, and indeed to serve our shareholders, is to have a young, fuel efficient, environmentally friendly fleet. And we've been very focused on that, and will continue to be. But we're also doing things. For example, we've worked with an Irish NGO about offsetting our operational carbon footprint, which we did this year. And we have a lot of other initiatives as part of our innovation team, in terms of how we can be, try and be more proactive and do more on this front. So I think, environment is very important. And what I do think is different this time is that I think the environmental agenda in previous recessions tended to fall to the bottom of the list. I mean, I remember, I'm showing my age, but I remember, in the early 90s, there was a thing called stage 3 and stage 4, which was noise pollution, which was a big thing at the time. And I remember there was lots of work going on, trying to put hush kits and things on aircraft to make them quieter. And and the first Gulf War happened, and the market got into difficulty, and that literally went off the agenda, and nobody ever heard about it again. And I remember in 2001, there was the environmental agenda was definitely further up, and there was SAC and DAC engines, again for the technical out there. I remember single combustor and dual combustor engines. One was more fuel efficient than the other, and there was people wanted them, and then suddenly the 2001 happened, and then people didn't want them anymore. It was they were focused on survival. I think this time it is different. I mean, definitely I think the very nature of the pandemic and the way it's kind of shown, actually, it is a long game, and we actually have to think about these long-term big change risks in our industry. I think it's really focused people on that, not just in our industry, but I think right around the world. And I think the environmental agenda is definitely has not fallen down the list as it has in previous downturns, and I actually think it's probably gone up. And in fact, I had a couple of conversations with airline customers in the last couple of months where they actually said, we want to use this as an opportunity to actually refleet and to upgrade our fleet and reduce our carbon footprint. So I think that's one thing that's different this time. To go to your question about does the industry do enough? I don't think it does, Joe. No, look, I think the industry needs to do more about what we do. It's not just about telling a story. I think we need to do more real things on the ground, like having a more fuel efficient fleet, like improving things like ATC and how we manage assets on the ground and all these kind of things. But I do think we have a story to tell that we need to tell better and in a better way. And I think, as an industry, airlines, manufacturers, aircraft owners, we all need to do more of that to make sure that people understand the work that is happening in the industry to improve our carbon footprint. We have to do more work, but we also have to tell our story in a way that's constructive.
So you're looking at a combined body, the likes of an IATA or an AWG, just to throw a couple of names out. How do you do it on a cohesive level, or do you try and divide and conquer within the various segments?
I think we all have to do our piece. I mean, I think there's probably a broader. I mean, and I think IATA, I think Willie in his new role, Willie Walsh in his new role, as chatting to him about this just before Christmas. I think, I think that would be a really important part of his, and I think Willie will do a great job as the DG of IATA and telling the story of the industry. And I think the manufacturers will do their thing. I think as a wider industry, we all need to. So I think we need to tell our own stories, and we need to try and join up the stories. I think it's a bit of both. I also think what is really important is, I mean, and I always say one of the things that perhaps has come out of this crisis is, the importance of air travel and what a fundamentally important part of the world it is, of society, of experience. I mean, what an important role it plays in not just the economy, but in the social infrastructure of the world. And I think that's something that I think as an industry we need to both tell a bit better and generally aviation does a lot of good things. It certainly, like many industries, it does have a carbon footprint which you need to manage and reduce, but it also is an industry that provides a lot of positive things for the world and a lot of positive economic and social activity, which I think we're all missing in the current environment. And I find one of the things that reassures me even in these challenging times, if you go and do a vox pop amongst your own social circle, virtually obviously these days, people can't wait to get back and travel and see places and see people and see family and friends. So I think we need, as an industry, need to remind ourselves about all the good things we do as well as some of the challenges we face.
Amen to all of that, Peter. Can I ask you, just in closing, as you look out over 2021, what are your optimism levels like?
Good question, Joe. I think they are positive with a tone of caution. Okay, I mean, I think one thing we have seen in the last 9 months is that there's a lot of stuff we don't know. Okay, but ultimately, I am optimistic that on a couple of fronts. Firstly, that fundamentals, the fundamental demand, the fundamental need for air travel will return. I am optimistic at a general level that the ingenuity of humans, of the scientists, all the women and men around the world who've developed these vaccines and all the things that we've done well. I mean, I never bet against the engineers and the scientists. We will find the way through this, and I'm very confident of that. But having said that, it is going to be a challenging road. It's not going to be simple, and there will be 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I think here in Ireland we're experiencing a step back at the moment, but we will get there. And ultimately, I am optimistic. It probably will take a bit longer than we would like, or perhaps some of us expect. But I do think that the recovery will take hold in 2021. And I think when we're having this conversation, hopefully in person, Joe, not in our mutual virtual offices, in this time next year, I think we'll be looking back on a year of that's been much better than 2020.
I think we can all echo those sentiments. I'd like to thank you for your great insights today and wish you and SMBC Aviation Capital all the best over 2021. Thanks.
Thanks for the time, Joe. Appreciate it.